their POs came in with barcodes, right? It couldn't be easier. They just had to scan it to receive it. So part of it was absolutely training. And the other part, we actually did some, I would call it almost overviews, but helping everybody from the person on the receiving dock through the production floor, through planning and scheduling, through accounts payable, help them understand where they fit in the process and what happened if they dropped their link of the supply chain.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Procurement plays an extremely important role in ensuring that you have the right raw materials at the right place at the right time. They are also responsible for the S&OP planning, which is the hardest to master, and misaligned S&OP functions could significantly impact the top and bottom line, and they are often left behind when it comes to their technology needs. They are also an afterthought in the organization in creating sophisticated procurement processes that will have tangible financial results. But what do procurement professionals need to perform their duties? Is ERP enough, or do they need more? Where do systems such as P2P, CLM, spend analysis, supplier discovery, supplier information management, eSourcing, contract management, eProcurement, eInvoicing, supplier management fit in the architecture? And how to design an architecture that allows companies to create process boundaries between these systems and share information while maintaining a single source of truth. In today's episode, we invited cross-functional experts for a LinkedIn Live who brings significant expertise to discuss procurement information architecture. We covered many grounds, including stories related to different systems that procurement function needs and the role of MDM and CLM in the architecture. Finally, we discussed the vendor collaboration required at various stages of the order lifecycle, starting from the design, procurement, finance, and production. With that, let's get to the conversation. Everyone, welcome to today's show. For today, the topic that we have is going to be related to procurement department. And we are going to be discussing all the systems that the procurement department is going to need. We are going to be mapping these systems with the specific roles that procurement department has. What are going to be their specific needs? If they are going to be using any specialized systems other than ERP, then we need to discuss any of the architectural issues from the source of authority perspective, as well as how to construct this architecture so that systems can talk to each other and the teams can do their job. So we are going to start with everybody's intro. I am going to start with Tom.
Sure, Sam. Thanks. My name is Tom Rodden. I am CIO at Varian Medical Systems, and as CIO here, I have a great deal to do with procurement. We are interested in supporting that function that serves the entire span of the business operations, but we also have our own selfish interests in IT because we do a lot of procurement ourselves, from the hardware to the software in all forms of software, subscription and regular licensing, as well as services, maintenance, consulting. So we're a big user of procurement services, and we're a big enabler. So I have lots of opinions and happy to share them today.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Tom. Scott, I'm actually going to move to you next for your introduction, if you don't mind.
Sure, and thanks for having me. This is Scott Engelking. I run a company called Grandview Integration. It's a consulting firm. I do specialize a lot around procurement, source to pay, accounts payable, that area. I had a 30-year career in a pharmaceutical company, was an executive. I ran our ERP team, and I worked at different times in strategic sourcing. I ran the procurement team and the accounts payable team, and had a long background there. And now I help a lot of companies in consulting in this arena. So thanks very much for having me, Sam.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Scott. Melissa, can I move to you next for your intro?
Sure. My name is Melissa Drew. I'm currently working with IBM. I've got 27 years of procurement and supply chain experience, working a lot within manufacturing and automotive. And I really sit at the intersection between what that procurement and supply chain looks like in the future, infused with cognitive technologies.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Melissa. And Mike, I am super excited to have you. That tornado situation is over.
It is. We've got sunny skies here where a half an hour ago it wasn't such a pleasant outlook. So thank you, Sam. Appreciate the late and dramatic entrance. Always happy to be here. So my name is Mike Ryan, and what I do is I help B2B manufacturers crush the inventory iceberg and help free up their supply chain and create cash. So happy to be a part of the panel today, Sam.
And for today, we are going to crush the procurement department. Thank you so much for being here, Mike. All right, guys. So we are going to be starting with the stories. And if you guys are going to have any specific stories, and what I am looking for in these stories is going to be, if you want to pick any sort of, manufacturing or product-centered business, and that is going to be the procurement department. So maybe talk about the business a little bit, what kind of business model, what kind of procurement processes they had, and how many different systems they had in the architecture. So, Tom, I am going to start with you. Would you like to share your story related to the procurement? How many different systems, how they spoke to each other?
Sure, and I'm not sure it's a story, but I will explain the landscape, and maybe someone will have questions about that. So specifically at Varian, but this was common. I also did consulting for about 10 years in IT systems before joining Varian Medical Systems, and a lot of that was ERP related. So the ERP backbone was certainly one key fundamental part of that landscape and the architecture. So the boundaries of an ERP can vary. ERPs are different, and companies like to use them differently. But in my experience, typically it was the source of truth for vendor master, for product master, and of course, products have specific data elements related to procurement, among other things. And so for the product master, typically the ERP was a core. And then, of course, it was the transactional system of record for purchase recs, purchase orders, maybe information records of various kinds, supply agreements. So those transactional and supporting records were what we typically, and we today even at Varian, use our ERP for. But in addition to that, we have a contract lifecycle, a CLM solution that is where the final versions of contracts are stored and where the interim versions often are also managed. So the redlining process is often executed within the CLM system so that we have an ongoing, a history of negotiations in redline until we get to that final agreement. And so that's usually a critical component, and it's not something typically that's managed effectively in the ERP. So that's a separate piece of the architecture for us. A third piece of the architecture that I have seen, in some cases at least, is I'll call it the procurement planning system. Yeah. So in addition to vendor master, material master, or product master, and basic transacting of business related to procurement activities, there is the actual strategic side and sometimes tactical side of contract or vendor management. And by that I mean the tools or the system that enables you to manage the critical elements of the contract, renewal dates, maybe key terms and conditions, maybe some basic pricing information. I have not seen yet that done effectively with the CLM system, what I'm talking about, but the whole process of triggering the renewals, the start of negotiations, and so that has at Varian been done in a couple of different systems typically, but a SharePoint or something like that where we've done that sort of product, or I should say vendor negotiations, strategy management. And then the last thing that I was thinking about was productivity tools. So we work with the procurement team on some forms of automation, bots, and such like. So that's and there are a number of different tools out there. We have one that we've standardized on, and that is something that we've used to help with some of the data cleanup and data management. That is an add-on and another piece of that architecture and that landscape. So those are the four big elements. I actually, maybe in closing on this little bit, would add that I have come across recently, been pinged recently by a company that offers what it calls its VRM. Okay. And I thought that was interesting. I haven't really explored that yet. But of course, everybody's familiar with CRM. But this is an actual claim for a complete package to manage the vendor, like CRM is often considered to be a pretty complete package to manage the customer. And so I think that's something relatively new, at least in my experience, and it's something that I want to investigate. It could be another part of the landscape potentially.
Okay, amazing. Some very interesting insights there. And by the way, I mean, VRM is slightly newer for me, to be honest. I am familiar with SRM, which is the same thing, Supplier Relationship Management, Vendor Relationship Management. But they are probably, these terms are used interchangeably. So very interesting. So in this particular case, I am going to have some clarifying questions for you. So the CLM system that you had, obviously, this is a slightly more, simplified architecture. I'm pretty sure other guys are going to have slightly more complex architecture because they might be using multiple systems in their architecture. So in this particular case, obviously, ERP was used as the main source of truth. The CLM component that you had, was this from the same vendor? And was this natively integrated? Did you have to integrate it? Can you talk a little bit about the integration aspect of all of these tools?
So it was not from the same vendor.
Okay.
And it was not a natural, there were no pre-packaged APIs to deliver all of the integration. So we had to work with the vendors to develop that integration in the way that we wanted. But we were not doing extensive, deep integration. We wanted to have, for example, within our ERP, the ability with some hyperlinks to actually jump into the CLM system. If someone wanted to take a look at the contract that was behind this vendor's, the actual contracts that are the basis of our relationship with this vendor, that would be something that we'd want to be able to allow someone to seamlessly move to and view. But they weren't integrated in an extremely deep way. Again, we wanted, from a legal point of view in particular, and from a negotiating and a history point of view, to have that CLM system as a contract system of record, but it wasn't really driving the ERP behavior.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think CLM integration is going to be slightly on a lighter side. So I don't know if you manage any sort of vendors inside your CLM system. And in fact, from the CLM perspective, I don't know if you are going to have all of the vendors. You are probably going to have a subset of vendors that are really going to be heavy in the contract process. So I don't know if you had all of the vendors in your CLM system, and I don't know if you manage all of the contracts related to your HR, related to your customers, as well as your supplier, because my assumption here is going to be this is going to be a centralized system where you are managing all of the contracts related to your suppliers, customers, as well as other contracts that you might have.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Sam. That's right. Yeah, CLM was broader than procurement. It was customer, it was the gamut, right? That was the intent. And of course, it's sometimes challenging to get all of those contracts in there. There tend to be silos in the organization anywhere you go. So you really have to work at it to make that part of the normal process for all parts of the organization. So I would say, we had a large majority of the contracts probably in there from a procurement point of view because the procurement team really found it to be important. Sales was a little more challenging, and so they needed more persuasion, and it's probably not as complete. And different departments, legal, HR, IT, have been pretty heavy users of the CLM as well.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Tom. So, Scott, I'm actually going to come to you for your story, and I'm pretty sure your story is going to be slightly more complex in terms of the architecture because you are more of the proponent of, a lot more systems inside the P2P from the business perspective because there is a real business value in having, for example, I think you like to talk a lot about P2P system, the P-card system. So you are going to require a lot more systems than just the ERP. So do you want to share your story? What kind of architecture you had? And how did you manage the source of truth?
Yeah, and I think, building on to what Tom said is that, generally your ERP is the source of truth, and that's where everything's going to reside. So it all kind of flows through there. But I've seen a lot of other source to pay tools added on in addition to those mentioned. So like electronic catalogs, for example, to store your data, around purchasing. Tom mentioned robotics, and I've definitely seen that as well. Some robotics tools kind of built on, and I could talk about, some of the uses that I've seen of robotics in the source to pay area. Generally a procurement data warehouse, that's housing all of your spend information, and those may be, and there sometimes are end-to-end source to pay tools. But in this arena, there's no one tool that's identical, and people generally have a mishmash of various systems depending on their strategy. I've also seen some tools bolted on for sourcing and auctions. I've seen a lot of workflow tools, around your PO approval, invoice approval type of thing. I've seen specific tools around vendor onboarding, and those are, I think, emerging, to make sure that your vendors can manage their data on their own and that everything is, secure from that perspective. On the AP side, scanning and OCR are typically built, bolted on as well. And then I've seen also some data tools added on, to keep your vendor master data specifically. And those, like Tom said, sometimes those are not just, it's not a vendor master data tool. It's around customer master and material master as well. So a lot of times, you'll bolt some tools on for that. So I have seen at the various companies I worked with, a big spider web of tools around source to pay. It's usually one of the most technology rich areas in my experience.
So I am also going to have a follow-up question for you. So, one of the complaints that I hear from a lot of people, and let's say, if you are going to have a CIO or the IT guy, for them, they are always going to want to simplify the architecture as much, because when you are going to have multiple systems, it's a nightmare for IT guys, I'm telling you. Okay, but from the business perspective, from the user perspective, they all want, the fanciest tools possible. They want to make it as easy as possible. And one of the reasons why they say that, two reasons, in fact, two reasons are going to be, number one, ERP is very hard to learn. Number two is going to be, it's very slow. So now, in your case, when you are building this architecture, and you mentioned that, I am going to use some sort of MDM tool, which is going to maintain the master data, and that's going to be sort of the broker for all of the spider web that you might have. You might have your PO tool, you might have your ERP, and everything is going to your vendor master. And that's how you sort of know that, okay, you have the actual instance of the vendor master. You are not off from your architecture. So in this particular case, in my experience, when I have seen the MDM implementation, it slows the heck out of the process, okay? Because it has to go to every single transaction has to go to MDM and then come back and then make determination, what is happening here, right? So in your experience now, even if these guys are going to use these tiny sassy tools, is what I like to call, okay, because they are very easy to use. They are, they have really beautiful UI. They don't have to worry about GL errors as they would in case of an ERP. It's super easy. But from the slowness perspective, I guess once you actually incorporate your MDM,
in the architecture, it's going to be a nightmare overall in terms of the user experience overall from the adoption as well. Have you seen something similar in your experience?
I mean, I don't know that I've seen that type of nightmare scenario. Certainly, I've seen tools implemented, and then all of a sudden the cycle time slows down because there's handoffs or there's systems that aren't talking together properly. So I think it's very important to have end-to-end cycle time metrics, and you're going to really upset your users if it takes a month to onboard a vendor or something like that. So you really have to get your And one thing I tell everybody is, don't just implement a tool, document your process first. Let's understand the whole process. Let's get it documented into swim lanes, get it down on paper. And then if you do implement a tool, you do need to think about who's interfacing with that tool and how, and what are the cycle times, what's the turnaround time going to be, and you need to set some tight metrics around that. And my experience is that you can, even with a complex, web of tools, as long as you've got good interfaces and good SLAs and good metrics, you can actually, have some pretty good cycle time. So I guess I haven't seen that. I certainly have come across companies that had really, really slow cycle, but I think there's generally a way to improve it and work on it.
Yeah, and it's not going to be just the issue of being slow. I think there are going to be design issues overall. I mean, you are never going to have seamless experience when the systems are going to talk to each other. There are always going to be exceptions. There are going to be reconciliation issues when you are going to have multiple systems. So that typically creates a lot more problems than having the advantage of having multiple systems.
And that's where I've seen some, talking about robotics, I've seen some of the robotics tools be used to shorten that cycle time and to have your robotic process working overnight, or things are happening in batch, so there's ways to design your process so that they have the good turnaround. And I think you want to put your vendor data in the hands of your vendors to the greatest extent you can. So anyway, I think there's ways.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Scott. So I'm actually going to move to Melissa. Melissa, what have you seen in your experience in terms of the architecture?
Yeah, so this was the good news of going after Tom and after Scott, because I got to really think about it. I looked at it from specifically a client of mine in cosmetics. They actually manufacture and create their cosmetics. And in walking through that process, I came up with 16, 17 different systems. It's the ERP, in some cases, multiple ERP instances, and not the same ERP, but all the different ERP systems. PLM system, a procurement system, and if I'm lucky, it's one procurement system. If I'm unlucky, it could be one procurement company for like sourcing and contracts, and another procurement company for invoicing and procurement. And there's a supplier portal associated with that. Then you've got the finance systems. Sometimes there's a separate finance systems for specific nuances. Quality issue management, oftentimes that's a completely separate system because it can't be lumped into procurement. Engineering specifications, because again, we're creating a lot of our products and there's a separate supplier portal for that. Risk management systems, supply chain systems, performance and metric systems, which have other supplier portals associated with that. Middleware, Sterling, MuleSoft, some type of middleware that transforms the data. As you mentioned, MDM, MDG, some type of correlation there. Scott, you mentioned OCR, legal. There's also the taxware systems that I'm integrating with. And then if I'm lucky, I have some sort of data lake or data warehouse. And that got us to about 16, 17 different systems there.
Yeah, so very, very, very interesting
Way too many.
architecture. Yeah,
Way too many.
And that's where the real complexity is. And I am going to touch on some of the points there. So, for example, let's say if you are using multiple ERP systems, sometimes that could be okay. Let's say if they are not going to be operationally integrated, they might be simply financially integrated. Financial integration is easy, guys. It's not as difficult as when you are trying to integrate operationally. And in most cases, even if people might claim, they have a real multi-entity architecture or they have real integration across their business units, they are super fancy. But in my experience, I have not really seen real integration of systems where they are going to have the contract that can be done across the entities or across the sites. You are doing, let's say, the bank reconciliation across the sites. We have not seen, at least in my experience, I have not seen even with the bigger organization. So if you have multiple ERP systems in the architecture, that might be okay. But now you have multiple systems that are storing your vendor data. And that's where the problem is. When you
Yes.
have your operational data sitting in multiple systems, reconciling that unless you have MDM. If you have MDM, the challenge is it's going to slow the process, right?
I'm laughing because I just got off so I've been working on something for the last 3 weeks with a client, a manufacturing client, and they have multiple ERPs that represent different business units of their company. And one of their companies decided that they were going to do this automated synchronization between their cloud procurement system, their MDG, and their ERP. And now the other business unit wants to come in, but there's limitations with this cloud software that they can only do one integration. So now we're having to come up with these multiple alternative workarounds and options to either, can we do will everybody like it and play nice and do a central MDG, which would pull the vendor data in and split it out across multiple ERPs? Can I do a workaround where I've got to do custom APIs that pull it into a middleware and then push it into the second business unit's ERP system? We're coming up with just workarounds after workarounds because of the limitations of these systems when it comes to exactly what you've said, Sam, talking and compiling their vendors. And then to make it even more worse, the process for suppliers is different for direct suppliers than it is for indirect suppliers. So let's add that layer on top of there.
So let's say, what would you do? So obviously, users are going to demand as many systems as possible in the architecture. And I don't know if you are going to have as much influence as Tom. Seems like he has been able to have real influence on his company that nobody's buying any other systems. The only thing you are going to have is ERP, which is very rare because users are sort of, pulling in different direction. They have their own budget. Sometimes they might buy a system. And then after 6 months, you're going to know that, there was a system that these guys were using. And now you have to figure out how to integrate that.
There is. Take everything you know today and completely push it out the window and let it just crash and fall. That's step one. So what we've been doing for the last 5 years is we've been either trying to pull data together because they've all been in silos and we think that we need to come together. And that's a huge harmonization and just a huge data effort and cleaning effort. Then we shifted away and said, well, no, let's do a data lake or data warehouse, or let's do a combined lake house is the new term. But again, that's a lot of custom integrations with systems that never used to talk to each other. So the new way, and just still getting there on the trend, is push all that aside, let the systems stay where they are, and let's build this data fabric. So this data fabric sits on top of all of your systems. It pulls it together. You've got 3 layers, this layer that connects all the systems together. The next layer is where all the queries are together, and the next layer is where you have the users together. It's a similar concept to, say, a data lake, but it works they call it a fabric because it's much more flexible and allows the systems to be added on as many as you need as your companies acquire or as they spin off, without having to completely redo all these manual integrations that you built. So that's the trend that we're heading into.
Yeah, so I am actually going to move to, Mike, but I'm going to have just one comment. People talk about data lake, the analytics layer. For me, personally, to be honest, I am going to be okay if my analytics is going to be a little off. But if I am not able to process my sales order, if I'm not able to process my PO, if I'm not able to cut invoice, that's a real problem. And that's where the integration needs to happen, that, these systems need to be really connected as part of the operational core analytics. Sure, there might be a little bit of problem we can resolve. We might have some time. But, if your operations are going to be off, then it's a real problem. So, Mike, I'm actually going to move to you for your story. How many systems can you beat Melissa? Are you going to sit somewhere in the middle between Tom and Melissa?
No, I'm definitely not going to break the record in terms of number of systems and number of architecture. The bar has been set far too high. A lot of the work that I do, I'll say the architecture is functional, and where the businesses stumble really is around the processes that support the systems. So work with a client, interestingly enough, they're also cosmetics, and their challenge, the problem I was brought in to solve was the CEO says, my inventory is always wrong. And I'm like, okay, well, can you give me some color?
Yeah.
Clickety clack. He flips his computer around. He says, read this email. So, okay. All right, it says, Peter, you suck, period. We gave you a purchase order 60 days ago and you're late, right? If you keep this up, we're going to quit ordering. And he says, I want to stop getting emails like this. Okay, that's fair. So as I started to work with the business, they use Microsoft Dynamics, which it can be complicated, but in their instance, it was relatively straightforward, and started looking at, okay, do they have the right data? Is the right information getting in the system? And what we found was when the information was getting in the system was working as it should, right? So the architecture was holding up. They were running into problems with their processes. So one of the biggest stumbling blocks, and this is kind of one of those like facepalm moments, is the person doing the receiving was not receiving the POs into their system. So the system never knew that the inventory arrived, right? And then they knew that this chemical, it was hot, and they got it out to the floor so they could mix it and they could use it, and then they never completed their work orders. So they'd run into a situation where they'd go to get a raw material off the shelf. System says, oh, you've got 1,073 kilograms, you're fine, and you go to the shelf and you shake the drum and it's empty. And insult to injury is because that PO was never received, accounts payable never received the trigger to pay the vendor. So now it's calling up the vendor to say, hey, I need you to hotshot a drum for me. And they're saying, well, tough cookies, because you still haven't paid us for the last one. So now it's working with accounts payable and getting sign off from the CFO to do a wire transfer so they could pay the vendor so they can ship another drum. Right. So in this case, the system worked fine. Right? It wasn't a systems issue. It wasn't an architecture issue. It was the people and lack of process that didn't use the system. So a lot of the problems that I see and I deal with, I think relative to the rest of the panel, are kind of a little bit, maybe lower level or a different scope. It's, it's figuring out, is the system you have in place functional, and are you providing the right information to feed the system to create the outputs that are desired? So that's my pseudo architecture story.
Okay, amazing. So I'm actually going to have a clarifying question to you as well. So in this particular instance, I don't know if you solved the problem or and maybe you want to talk about the solution. So
sure.
How can you create the solution? I don't know if there's going to be some sort of process control that you might be able to enable so that you don't have to train people, or is this going to be handled only by training and literally telling people that you have to do this or we are going to be in trouble?
Well, Sam, and that's a great question. So number one, yes, solve the problem. Number two, part of it was training, and part of it, quite frankly, I mean, their POs came in with barcodes, right? It couldn't be easier. They just had to scan it to receive it. So part of it was absolutely training. And the other part, really, I mean, we actually did some, I would call it almost overviews, but helping everybody from the person on the receiving dock through the production floor, through planning and scheduling, through accounts payable, help them understand where they fit in the process and what happened if they dropped their link of the supply chain. So part of it was absolutely tactical. Hey, this is what you need to do your job. And then part of it was broader to help everybody understand where they fit in the process and what their role in the process was, and helping them understand, right? Hey, if you drop the ball, if you fumble, if you don't connect the dots, everything's going to stop. And the insult is, it may not stop today. It's going to stop a week from today. And then everybody's going to be scratching their head, running around, trying to figure out where the problem actually started. Yeah, we fixed it.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Mike, for that. So, Tom, I'm actually going to come back to you. And one of the things that we are going to be discussing now is going to be vendor collaboration. And vendor collaboration, typically is extremely difficult in a lot of different industries. And my understanding is going to be probably it would be difficult for you as well, because you were in the medical device industry. So when we talk about industries such as automotive, electronics, medical device, this is where you really need to do the vendor collaboration. Now, there are different flavors of vendor collaboration, okay? So one vendor collaboration is going to be, you are going to be doing the vendor collaboration in your R&D phase, where you have the PLM, and PLM is going to have all the vendors, and you need to collaborate with them, even though you are not actually moving to the production floor just yet, but you need to collaborate with them. Maybe you are experimenting something, so you need to send the bombs to your vendors. They need to respond if the design is going to work or not. So PLM typically maintain a lot of vendor information. Now, you have some other tools in the market. For example, let's say if you talk about PO collaboration or AP collaboration, and what they are doing is anytime you're going to have changes in the PO, the vendors are actually going to sit right in the system. So they are going to get the back access in the same system so that you can collaborate with them in the real time, then going outside of the system, that's sending the email, then getting the email back, and then fixing your PO. So PO or the AP team or the procurement team really likes this aspect of vendor collaboration. So these 2 or 3 different aspects when we think of vendor collaboration, I don't know if you had in your industry, if you had, how did you manage it? Or how would you manage, let's say, if you are in these industries?
Well, you opened this segment today, Sam, asking for stories, and I didn't give you a story initially. I just described the landscape.
Okay.
And what you're triggering for me now is a little bit of a story, but I'll just quickly mention this, that from a collaboration point of view, in my experience, it's important to ensure that the vendors with whom you collaborate and to whom you provide some access to your systems do not have access that could undermine your procurement process and pose a lot of risk. So I saw in my early career several attempts of companies to provide access to vendors to the ERP system. And they'd say, well, then we can provide them with, insight into the BOMs. We can provide them with visibility in many different forms, the POs that we have with them and what our view of them is, the status. They could see, what when we book things in, deliveries, whether they achieved on-time delivery. There are all kinds of advantages of giving them some limited access. But what we found was that it was incredibly difficult. If you were persistent and intelligent and maybe even devious, you would find ways of seeing the pricing maybe of other vendors against whom you compete and seeing information that is in the ERP that you absolutely would not want those vendors to see. And so I have gradually become a person who believes that you really need to not bring them into your ERP. And you do need to have these other supplier management systems, portals that are maybe fed with a limited amount of information from your ERP and that are more designed for that kind of very granular access control, so that the vendors only really see, and there's absolutely no chance they'll see anything but what is appropriate for them. So that's kind of a little bit of a story that, we had some issues in my past, mostly in the consulting days when we were implementing ERPs, and that was something that the clients wanted. They wanted their vendors to have access, and it turned out to be problematic. So I have worked for the last 14 years at Varian, and Varian is relatively vertically integrated. So the degree of criticality for Varian's business is less than probably a lot of others when it comes to vendor collaboration. However, we do have a supplier portal. We do use that as a vehicle to provide information like CAD drawings or simplified versions of CAD drawings, or sometimes the full-blown information, to provide access to that for some vendors. Obviously, for them to see what demand is and be able to, in some cases, respond to that even without us placing the orders. They see the demand and they can actually put in their production plans or their delivery plans for us. So there's certainly a critical piece to me, that is the design of your supplier portal and how you want to interact and collaborate there. We have actually gone so far at Varian as to, for example, have a number of suppliers who, or I should say service providers, really subcontractors, who take components from Varian and assemble the finished products to have some degree of local content that can then sell more effectively into markets where that's a critical requirement, a higher percentage of local content. So at least the labor and some of the materials are locally sourced. And in order to ensure that those suppliers, those partners actually followed our manufacturing processes, we provided a link into our MES system as an example. So we modeled a complete production line in MES for those service providers, those partners, and so that was another level of collaboration with vendors or partners. So those are a couple of thoughts that were running through my mind as you were posing the question, Sam, and I'm sure other people have other interesting stories as well. But and we've of course got the more conventional types of collaboration through the supplier portal, where we're simply asking for people to provide us with details on their products so that we can place orders against them.
So I do have some follow-up questions there, and I probably would need some more details there. So you mentioned that you have the supplier collaboration portal. I don't know if it was out of the box as part of ERP. Did you custom build it? Did you buy it, off the shelf from another vendor? And the MES example is really interesting because you are sort of, providing the backdoor entry in your MES. So I don't know how you reconcile your vendor between your MES system as well as in the supplier portal. I don't know if they were connected. So can you paint some more colors there?
Sure. I mean, on the MES story, with that service provider, that partner, we really set up effectively a separate instance of the MES, a copy of what we were using in Switzerland for this supplier in Russia. So we did not really allow them in the back door to be able to access the ERP. The MES itself was a separate system from the ERP, and then we separated that instance of MES from the rest of the MES systems, which are really by geography. They're pretty local generally. So that was a specific copy of the system we had in Switzerland to be able to be used by the Russian team, the partner. But we did have to populate it with all the BOMs, all the routings, all of the materials, and so forth, and train them on how to use the system. But it was a very interesting exercise, and it's been pretty successful. I think the first part of your question, though, was more around the supplier portal itself. Yeah. And that, I think in the early days, people tried to use a package that was integrated with the ERP from the ERP supplier. Yeah. And we found that it just didn't have the necessary functionality. It was too limited. And we ended up going with a third-party solution, a specialist in this type of software. And we ended up integrating that with our ERP. So it is a completely separate system from a separate vendor.
Okay, very interesting. So
and I didn't put that on my list at the beginning. So
yeah, right. Yeah. So you had a lot more systems there. Okay, so I do have one more question related to MES. So the MES system, was it connected with the production data? Was it just a sandbox for them, just to play around and then, to understand how your production processes were?
No, it was a production system. They were the work instructions, the BOMs, they were all real production pieces of data, and the team in Moscow was executing per the work instructions. And I mean, the great thing was our people had visibility to them completing all of the steps in the routings and back flushing the materials and their documentation. So while there was a certain degree of risk, people said, because as much as you say it's a completely separate instance, be careful. Particularly be careful with our Russian friends, right? They're very good at finding doors. So even though you say it's completely separate, there is at some point a network connection, right, to the rest of your systems. So You really want to make sure that it is secure. But we had visibility to everything they were doing, and so if anything was being done improperly, we could basically shut that down and sit them down and talk it through. So
okay, amazing.
I didn't mean to digress so much into MES. It's kind of sort of related to procurement, but it's also different.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's a very interesting component because, so far the only thing I was aware of, was going to be either from the design collaboration perspective or in the ERP, but now MES could, open another problem of the collaboration and sort of reconciling these vendors everywhere. Thank you so much for that, Tom. I'm actually going to move to you, Scott. So from your experience when you work, in these vendor collaboration, now if you're collaborating in many different systems, and if you, let's say, have your MDM system, then probably the problem is not going to be as big. But still, even if you have MDM system, I would guess that, it's not going to be as easy to just have vendor data in so many different systems when you are actually doing the collaboration, because you are going to get so many different exceptions, so many boundary cases that you have to handle to make sure that these systems are able to talk to each other. So what have you seen in your experience, Scott?
I've seen the whole gamut on supplier portals. First of all, and actually this is one area where I work heavily in this. And generally I ask clients, do you have a supplier portal? And a lot of times they'll say yes. And I look at the functionality and it's basically, here's how to submit your invoice. Here's how to submit a form to talk to procurement. And that's about it. So the best in class that I've seen are these integrated, they're a web-based portal that's generally a bolt-on that's integrated well. But you pick up your purchase order from the system, you submit your invoice on the system. There's no other way to get status of your information on your payment or your PO or your invoice other than going into the system. I've even seen dispute management is something that for certain types of retailers who have a lot of disputes with vendors, there's a dispute management type of a functionality. I've seen discount systems right along that you submit your invoice and it asks you, hey, would you like to get paid a little bit earlier? We can give you a discount. That's a cash generation machine right there. I've had very similar experience to what Tom described in terms of giving your vendors access to your ERP, because the ERP is not designed to give one vendor only access to their stuff. You give them access to their stuff and they've got a lot of other access as well. So that's generally a rough way to go. Because, there can be some malicious activity. But going into that portal, I've seen a lot of functionality be built there. And with cybercrime, and I've seen my share of cybercrime or attempted cybercrime, these portals, they can be dual authenticated. The only way to update your vendor record, your bank account, is to go through this portal, and you can be dual authenticated there. So you're no longer taking calls about, hey, can you change my bank account? Because there's a ton of cybercrime out there, and I've seen significantly more functionality built onto that at the end. Not getting so much into the inventory because that's so hard to do, because that's really more kind of PO based, and that's really, really hard to do with the portal. It could be done, but it would be a lot more custom that would have to be built. And I'd have to understand somebody's requirements to help them build that.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Scott, for that. So, Mike, I'm actually going to move to you. So in your experience, what kind of vendor collaboration have you seen from the system perspective? Was this collaboration done right inside the ERP system? Did they have bolt-on solution on top of ERP? How many different types of collaboration have you seen from the design to your real the production one, and then MES?
So I'd say my experiences tend to be at both ends of the spectrum, where work with one business where virtually all of their orders came in EDI, and even the collaboration took place via EDI. So an EDI order would come in if there was basically a manufacturing response or saying, hey, I know you asked for 100, but we can only give you 87. Right? Yep. That took place there. So I would say very high level of integration and very effectively used, because that EDI information, it was fed into the system, and then from there it flowed through demand planning and the supply planning. So it was very heavily leveraged and heavily utilized. Then the other end of the spectrum is, I think, along the lines of some of the examples that Scott shared, where right? The portal, like super duper air quotes, the portal is, upload your PO here, or, a contact us. So if there's any kind of issue, it was a very simplistic web form. So my experiences, and I tend to operate a lot in the middle market, so businesses in the 30 million to 300 million in revenue, it tends to be binary, where they've got a high degree of systems implementation and utilization, and they run from a systems perspective, run a pretty tight ship, all the way down to the customer collaboration that occurs via telephone and fax. So it really is interesting. And I think the businesses that have been most effective at it are the ones who they bring a person in, or bring a firm in, who really understands what the architecture needs to be, what the solution needs to be for that problem. So saying, okay, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Hey, we've got these big customers who want to do EDI. Okay, we'll come up with an architecture and a solution that fits that problem. The challenge is where businesses can kind of get out over their skis when they've got a super system that is far exceeds the actual needs or capability for a business to actually utilize it. So it tends to be binary.
Okay, very interesting. So I'm actually going to build on top of that. So when you mentioned the EDI, in my experience, EDI transactions are meant for slightly more commercial transactions. When we talk about vendor collaboration, obviously you can collaborate on the commercial transaction. They can submit the PO. You could do that kind of collaboration as well. But for the most part, when you look at the vendor collaboration, typically that's going to be collaboration in your design. So I don't know if you can literally exchange your bombs as part of your EDI. As far as I know, I am not familiar with that. And the second thing is that, yes, the EDI is relevant, but the portals are used for the vendors that are not going to have the EDI infrastructure at their end. So if you are working with, let's say, the big box retailers or really big brands, they are going to have the EDI capabilities. But if you are working with, let's say, mom and pop, machine shop, they are not going to have EDI capabilities. And that's where your supplier, portal is going to be relevant. So do you share similar experience? Have you seen something similar? Or is this exchange happening only over the phone and email?
No. And it actually, you know what? I think it's interesting, because the thought that triggers, Sam, is whether we're talking vendor collaboration or customer collaboration, it's almost driven by who's the bigger fish, right? So if you have a vendor who's extremely sophisticated, and you are, let's say, on the smaller end of the spectrum, right? So that vendor may have some giant customers, and you may be on the smaller end of that scale. The vendor, it's been my experience that the vendor is going to determine in what ways they really want to interact. So sometimes the collaboration, the vendor collaboration, if the vendor is the 800-pound gorilla in the market and they're the only place that you can get product from, right? You have to, in some regards, let them lead the dance, right? If they say, hey, we're operating at a college physics level, and you guys are, drawing 2 + 2 on the chalkboard, you guys got to figure out how to up your game to bring the collaboration up to the expectations and the needs of that vendor, or you may not be able to get the product you need from them.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Mike, for that. So the only thing we can take right now is going to be closing advice from everybody. So Tom, I'm actually going to start with you for your closing advice for today.
Well, I would say simplicity and security are the two things to strive for. And I think it relates to the complexity landscape we've talked about, and I think it relates to some of the risks we have with different forms of collaboration and degrees of access. So I'd say simplicity and security are key words to keep in mind.
Yeah, I could not agree more. The simpler the architecture, the easier the life is going to be, at least from the architecture perspective. A lot of users are going to be super emotional with the newer technologies and the newer tools. But when you are going to be tying these things together, it could be slightly more difficult. Thank you so much, Tom, for that advice. Scott, I'm actually going to move to you for your closing advice.
I think, focusing on documenting your process. And if you are going to implement a technology, think about what your requirements are first and get those documented. There's so many ways to go. And, you really don't just go buy a tool and think it's going to solve all your problems. Document your requirements and think about what you're doing. And there's a lot of ways to solve a problem, so step back and go slow.
Amazing. Love it. I think I could not agree more that you should be solving on the paper first before that is implemented in the system. And if you cannot solve on the paper, don't try to implement, because if you implement, then you have to demolish and implement it again. That's going to be far more expensive process. Thank you so much for that. Mike, I'm actually going to move to you for your closing advice for today.
My closing advice, I think, is a bridge between Tom and Scott, in that, understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve, right? And then design the most simple, maybe elegant solution to solve that problem. And as you're solving the problem, understand what the requirements are, what the output is of the process, and document.
Okay, amazing. Love it. Thank you so much, Mike, for that. So that's it for today, guys. On that note, I really want to thank you, everybody, for your time and insights today.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Tom Rodden, head over to Varian.com. It's VARIAN.com. If you want to learn more about Scott Engelking, head over to GVintegration.com. It's GVINTEGRATION.com. If you want to learn more about Michael Ryan, head over to mryangroup.com. It's MRYANGROUP.com. If you want to learn more about Melissa Drew, follow her on LinkedIn. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you in your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Edmund Zagrin, who describes why the cost of spend is an important metric for some of the strategic sourcing categories. Also, the interview with Angela Thurman, who discusses the process for supplier capacity and quality planning. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.